This webinar will cover the changes that are taking place as of July 1, 2017 regarding the education disability definitions and evaluation procedures. The objectives of the training of the webinar are to review the reasons for some of the current changes, to talk about what those changes are in regards to the educational disability definitions and standards. For those who are not familiar with the difference, the definition is the description of the disability and how that the criteria associated with it. The standards define the evaluation procedures and participants. So we'll be talking about both as we go through the webinar. And then we'll briefly talk about our next steps. So for those who are not aware, the disability revision process has been pretty lengthy. It began on March 15, 2016. It involved multiple different groups who provided feedback as well as recommendations for revision. It began with a task force that was started with professionals and advocacy members and various stakeholders across the state. They got together and decided on which disabilities needed to be updated based on a review of needs. Between their recommendations and the department's revisions, stakeholder groups provided feedback, and the information went before the Students with Disabilities Advisory Council as well as the State Board of Education. There was a public hearing as well as a comment period that allowed for feedback from the general public, and further revisions were made to the disability revisions various times. The State Board of Education approved the standards being changed in March of 2017, and the definitions were finally approved on June 29, 2017. So we're currently in our new cycle of using these revisions. Any consent obtained after July 1, 2017 for an initial or comprehensive evaluation should follow these new standards and definitions that we will be reviewing today. The state of Tennessee currently has 16 disabilities associated with education needs. Out of those 16, 14 had revisions. 2 of those 14 only had minor wording, and those were multiple disabilities and specific learning disabilities. Because the wording changes were minor, it did not change the overall requirements of either disability category. We're not going to review those today. The remaining 12 disabilities that had either a definition change or standards change or both are autism, developmental delay, emotional disturbance, functional delay, intellectual disability, intellectually gifted, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, speech or language impairment, and visual impairment. So we're going to be going over the larger changes associated with each one of those disabilities through this webinar. Make sure that you review all of the categories, though, to know that every single change that's taken place. The assessment team members who are impacted are pretty much every team member that might be involved in this evaluation. We just listed a few of those to remind districts and those of you who are attending a training or this webinar to make sure that you speak with various members and to make sure that they are updated on the changes as well. So some of those may include school psychologists or their associated specialists, speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, special educators, general education teachers, parents, and LEA designees. As team members making decisions on eligibility, on assessment plan needs, everybody needs to be aware of the upcoming changes. Think about how you may be communicating those changes to the various groups that might be impacted. You may be aware that an update went out in the Special Education Update as well as the School Psychology Newsletter on May 25th, 2017. It basically stated that the changes were coming as of July 1 and then provided a comparison document of the changes of the disability standards from the current or the most recent to the current standards. It also clarified that for initial evaluations, as I had mentioned before, consent that is obtained on or after July 1 follows the new evaluation standards and definitions. It's important to keep in mind as team members that if students are being reevaluated, the team shouldn't automatically assume that a comprehensive reevaluation is needed just because there's been a change to the disability standards. The reevaluation review should take place just like it has been before. The team should make a decision based on the information reviewed regarding past and present levels of performance, as well as potential disability needs. The previous eligibility will be honored if there is no need for further evaluation. However, if the team feels that due to questioning whether the student continues to demonstrate a disability, if that disability is the most descriptive disability that the student is displaying, or if there's some reason that the team feels a comprehensive is needed, the team will need to follow the new standards if a comprehensive evaluation is completed. So as we're reviewing this information, I highly encourage you to pause and to make sure that you pull up the forms associated with the disability changes. There are two different forms online, and I'm going to show you where those are housed in a second. But the forms that I would recommend that you pull up are the assessment documentation forms, which is our checklist that documents the outline of the different definition components, as well as the evaluation procedures and the participants. And then the definitions and standards for each disability category, which are linked to the disabilities, that provides you with a full breakdown of all the information. It's not just an outline, it's everything that should go into that disability category. So here's the links where you can find those forms. You can see at the top of the page, top of the slide, the link is there, and that's our special education evaluation and eligibility site for Tennessee.gov. On that site, just above the link that says disability evaluations and eligibility, there is another link for the comparison document now housed on the site. So if you would like to, if you did not receive that through one of the updates or newsletters, you can go on to the state website and pull up that comparison document there. If you click on the disability evaluation and eligibility tab, you will see that underneath it is a link that can take you to all the prior definitions and standards associated with the disabilities. If you are currently working under an evaluation where consent was obtained prior to July 1, 2017, you will still need to follow the previous eligibility definitions and standards. So if your consent before July 1, make sure that you are following those prior standards and definitions. If your consent was obtained after July 1, if you click on the link associated with the disability name, that will be your definitions and standards as I mentioned before, and the form underneath it is your assessment documentation form, which is your outline. We will also be uploading as completed guidance evaluation documents that will replace the old resource packets associated with different disabilities, and any other forms that appear to go along with the evaluation will also be included. So some questions to consider as we're working through this. This is a good time to step back and take some reflection about current practices and the changes that are upcoming. So I'd recommend that as we're walking through this and as you're looking at your documents, you're thinking about what specific changes stand out most and how will those changes impact your practice. Again, taking a step back and reflecting on best practices and assessment practices in general as well. Think about what you might need to meet some of these new requirements and who else needs to know this information and how you will communicate that. Some challenges that you might expect to face, so I'd write down some questions that you may have as you go through, and then how does this strengthen your practice. So overall our hope is that these changes will increase our practice as a state to make sure that we are accurately identifying students for services as best we can. The updates are intended to meet the updated differences that we know within each disability category, as well as to refine our current assessment practices as best we can. So there's some general revisions made to every single category. So while 12 disabilities had major revisions, all disabilities, all 16, had some general formatting and some wording changes for clarity purposes. And this wasn't within the actual standards necessarily. There were some introductions into the evaluations and then some wording on how to document adverse impact. So the first of those major revisions is a statement above every comprehensive evaluation that says that that evaluation is a multidisciplinary team approach. So it's a reminder that the evaluation, while being led by an assessment specialist who will interpret and analyze the data collected, collects information from various team members with various perspectives that includes a varied source of information. So we're using not just one source of information to determine eligibility, but we're looking at the collection of evidence that we obtained through the evaluation to make decisions. The instruments used need to be sensitive to cultural, linguistic, and environmental factors or sensory impairment such as vision or hearing impairment. So as we think about our evaluation practices, this is going to be a big one that is pointed out throughout the changes made to the evaluation standards, that we are really trying to make sure that we're not using instruments or assessment instruments that are comfortable only, but we're using those instruments that are specific to the student, making sure that they line up to the student's background, the norms associated with the population that the student's within, and that we are being sensitive to anything that might bias test results. Other wording changes that were included in every disability area had to do with usually the last standard for every procedure, evaluation procedure, talking about how to document how a student's disability adversely impacts educational performance. The additional language that was included at the very end of that sentence, you can see it says IE to include academic and or non-academic areas when we're talking about educational performance. So remember that we're not just talking about grades or academic achievement when we're talking about how a student might need specialized instruction related services. We're also talking about communication, adaptive behaviors, physical needs, that would require some specialized instruction and services in order to help the student access the general education environment and be successful in school. There were some participant changes across the board, just for, again, clarity's sake, as well as to make sure that we have our most up-to-date assessment specialists listed. And so for any disability category that required a physician, a licensed physician involved, we included a breakdown of that list. And then speech-language teachers were included as assessment specialists on evaluations involving communication and language. However, they're not certified to assess those areas, so a speech-language pathologist was changed, was put on the list instead of the speech-language teacher. So we're going to get into our first autism definition, our first disability definition, and that's autism. And you can see that the very beginning part of the definition of autism did not change. It's still consistent with IDEA language, and basically it outlines that autism is a developmental disability that significantly affects verbal and nonverbal communication, social interaction, generally evident before age 3, and has very specific characteristics associated with the disability. It does not apply if the primary reason a student's educational performance is adversely affected is due to emotional disturbance. The changes associated with the definition of autism, you can see prior to July 1, the language of who all that umbrella term covers really got specific into various disorders. It was summed up in a much briefer, compact statement, just to say that the term of autism includes students who've been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, such as autism or pervasive developmental disorder or Asperger's syndrome. Didn't list out all the different areas, all the different potential diagnoses. And while we know that those diagnoses have changed now, it still includes previous students who've been previously diagnosed with other disabilities that were previously associated with autism spectrum. And really what we're making sure of is that the students meet the criteria for autism in general. This is an educational disability. It's not a diagnosis necessarily. And because of that, there were some additional information that the state had added previously, and it was updated this year to include the most updated understanding of the characteristics associated with autism. So previously it stated that if a student was displaying symptoms, those need to be displayed prior to age 3. The change in the criteria associated with autism now states that those characteristics need to be present in early childhood, and that you would expect that as social demands increase, you'll see those characteristics more pronounced. So there's quite a bit of differences between the prior definition and the current definition in regards to the characteristics associated with autism. Not so much in that we're looking for different characteristics, but how they're grouped together and the combination of those characteristics. So the previous definition, the first and second characteristic are collapsed into one, and that's Part A. So Part A of those characteristics states that there's persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. That means that we are no longer necessarily looking for a language delay in itself. We're looking for social communication deficits that impact social interaction across multiple contexts. And to do that, a child needs to display all three of the deficits associated with social communication and social interaction listed. So it's all three of the following: deficits in social and emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors used for social interaction, and again, we're talking about that social communication part, and then deficits in developing and maintaining relationships appropriate to developmental norms. So what's not included on this slide, you'll see that the sentences are not finished for those three characteristics under Part A. And in the definition, if you have it in front of you, you'll see a breakdown of examples of how that might be displayed. Again, this was changed to be consistent with current characteristics associated in the diagnostic world. While we're not diagnosing, we are trying to make sure that characteristics do still line up with current understanding of autism. The third characteristic that was in the prior definition has now been is now part of Part B. So we have a Part A and a Part B that must be present in order for a student to meet the criteria for autism. Part B states that there are restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following four types of symptoms. So that might include stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements, or use of objects, excessive adherence to routines, ritualized behaviors, patterns, or verbal, nonverbal behavior, excessive resistance to change. Or 3, highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal intensity or focus. Or 4, hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusually interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So 2 of the 4 of those must be present. We must have all of A, 2 of B, and again, the definition goes into some examples of those 4 subsets of Part B. Evaluation of autism, just as with any other evaluation as we made revisions, we really tried to align our current evaluation procedures to match what the definitions are asking. So the purpose of the evaluation, remember, is just to make sure that we have enough information to determine that a student meets the definition associated with each disability category. So the first change is our behavioral observations. While we still have to have the behavioral observations, which is more than one, have to take place in 2 or more settings, and they do this based on our new criteria, need to make sure that they're addressing characteristics related to autism. While that might have been assumed before, we wanted to make sure it was clearly laid out that those behavioral observations are specific to those characteristics related to autism and how the student's functioning in the school environment. And then the second change for the evaluation procedures is related to the medical statement. So previously it was required that we obtained information from a physician or neurological information associated with general health history, and we're also trying to make sure that we determine that there's nothing else health-related causing the potential characteristics that we're observing. So that changed, and we're now just required to have a health history. Some parents may be able to provide a thorough history without having to go to a physician. However, this is the team decision on whether or not you feel like more information is needed in order to make sure that you have the appropriate category that you're evaluating for needs in special education services. And so if you feel like you need more information, of course, please reach out to the physician. Please get more information to help the team make the best decision for the student. The prior evaluation standards had kind of included all of the aspects of the direct assessments together, but those are broken out in the new standards. So the first thing that needs to be addressed are pragmatic communication skills. That is a minimum that needs to be done as far as communication for autism. If, based on a referral concern, there are more language concerns associated with expressive, receptive, or combined language, then that would be assessed further. So it really depends on the referral concern for that student, but pragmatic communications is the minimum that needs to be completed. So again, we're looking at social communication for the definition, although we know that language delays in general are often associated with autism. The next change is, instead of just social skills, we want to make sure that we are getting a full understanding of the student's social and emotional and behavioral functioning. Most of those characteristics are not just social, there's also some behavioral differences, and we're also trying to make sure that we're not mislabeling a student or misidentifying a student who may fit under the emotional disturbance category. So to make sure that we meet this, we're evaluating appropriately. There needs to be at least one assessment that's standardized and normed to autism, and then one general measure of social, emotional, or behavioral function. So one specific towards autism, one that's a general measure, and again, it's just a collection of information to help us identify those differences that the student may be displaying compared to typical peers. Sensory was also added in. This was previously not included, but as we know, that's one of the 4 characteristics under Part B that we might be looking for, and so it needs to be assessed every time. Sensory may be assessed as part of your autism scales, your autism instrument, but if it's not, then that needs to be addressed. It depends on the referral concern on how you address that. It may be through, like I said before, your autism scales. It may be a separate sensory profile that would be completed, and that's up to the team's discretion and assessment specialists who are working with the student. Academic skills is also added, and this is general information, so it could be, if the student's not struggling with academics, an overview of the student's current academic functioning in class, as well as a summary of the curriculum-based measures and statewide assessment results for that student. If there are concerns related to academic skills, an individualized academic achievement test may be administered as well. And just like for every disability statement, as stated earlier, the adverse impact of that student's disability can include academic or non-academic areas. Deaf-blindness, there were no changes in the definition, and the only changes associated with the procedures had to do with those that change for visual impairment. So I'm not going to discuss that quite yet. We're going to wait till we get to visual impairment to talk about what those changes are. So for developmental delay, the definition, you can see in bold that the statements that were added. The age band changes that were added for clarity. They are not changes to what was. It's just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands what that age band refers to. So developmental delay refers to children aged 3 years and 0 months through 9 years and 11 months. So that's until a 10th birthday, the conclusion of the 9th year of that child. Developmental delay, it can be used. It includes 5 different domains, and here is where a change occurred. So the domains include cognitive, communication, social, emotional, adaptive, or physical. And so physical previously included a combined physical of gross and fine motor. Now you can break it apart, and it could be gross motor or fine motor or the combined physical development of that child. When we're talking about the areas of delay, so one of those 5 areas, previously and currently, in order to show a delay, you have to have at least 2 areas that are 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, or 1 area that's 2 standard deviations below the mean. So we're going to focus on the first one. So it's 2 areas that's 1.5 standard deviations from the mean. And the language that was added includes information about where that falls in regards to percentiles, and that was added just for reference sake for those who might not be familiar with standard deviations. What was added as far as meaningful difference has to do with the consideration of the standard error of measurement. So anytime we're going to talk about specific scores or standard deviations, the team and the assessment specialists need to pay attention to that standard error of measurement for that specific student. So there's some guidance that will be in the guidance manuals associated with the disabilities about standard error of measurement. And I want to make sure we kind of talk about that a little bit right now. And that this is a case-by-case basis. It's not a carte blanche. This is a range for all students. For those of you who are unfamiliar with SEM, or standard error of measurement, that's basically saying that on any given day, a student's score can fall between a certain range, 90% of the time or 95% of the time, whatever confidence interval that you're using. So for students, they have a score. We know that there could be a range where that score might fall. And so that range should be considered because there could have been things that have impacted that student's testing. So that's what we're going to ask you to do, is to look at things that may have impacted that student's testing on a case-by-case basis. Each disability category guidance document should have the Tennessee Assessment Instrumentation Selection Form that reviews different factors that might cause performance changes on tests. So as you're completing that form, pay attention to how those things that stand out that you may need to pick a different that's more specific to the needs of that student. So we're going to look at what was used, how we used it, and then what's the other supporting evidence telling us from the evaluation. What are your observations, your checklists, your other direct assessments? What are they telling you combined that leads you to think that this might be an over or underestimate of ability? And then that assessment specialist who's trained in either intellectual functioning or whatever assessment that's being performed is also able to speak to the observations completed as part of that assessment, as well as their knowledge of that general that assessment that they've given to weigh in on the possible impact of testing and how that student may have demonstrated some things that could have skewed the results. So just like previous assessments, there still needed to be a measure of developmental skills using individualized procedures, and we just want to make sure that that's a standardized assessment that's included in that, that's normed. And by individual, we're not meaning that it couldn't be a team assessment approach, but it needs to be focused on just one child at a time. That standardized assessment will provide normative information to provide age norms for the team. If the functioning of that student does not allow for standardized assessment, I would go ahead and attempt it first. If you're not able to obtain a score based on the student's inability to perform on that assessment, then make sure that you're documenting the information that you have based on their skills that are observed. So now we're going to talk about, again, that the one area that could be 2 standard deviations below the mean. Remember, we had 2 areas that's 1.5 standard deviations from the mean, or one of the 5 areas that's 2 standard deviations below the mean. And again, the same language was added to this in regards to percentiles for reference sake, as well as the consideration of the standard error of measure. The same consideration as mentioned before. If there is an area that's 2 standard deviations from the mean, this is not a change in that we are still considering the most appropriate disability category that would match that student's profile. Developmental delay may be the most appropriate, or there may be another category that's most appropriate, and the team needs to consider what those would be. Again, the only language that was added was the percentile reference, as well as the consideration of standard error of measurement. When we're talking about re-evaluations, there was some significant language change. Previously, a re-evaluation included a comprehensive assessment, just like it still now will include that. The difference is that cognitive functioning was required as part of that assessment, and that you would decide on the areas that needed to be done based on the team's decision in regards to developmental delay. Now, what we're asking teams to do is, because at age 7, the student may age out of developmental delay in the near future, that comprehensive assessment include any disability category evaluation procedures that you think that the student may qualify for. So if you're considering developmental delay to continue for the next 2 years, 1.5 years, then go ahead and make sure you're testing all those areas. But you also need to consider anything else that the student might be displaying. If you're thinking that it no longer demonstrates developmental delay, but may demonstrate characteristics of another disability category, test those components of that disability category. A file review is not permissible after age 7. Emotional disturbance, there were quite a few changes in the definition. Previously, the definition included some state added language, and based on a review of stakeholder feedback as well as State Board of Education review, there were changes made that removed the language associated with the Tennessee added language, and now the definition completely mirrors IDEA language only. So you can see in the very beginning part of that definition, what was removed is that during that extended period of time of the characteristics of emotional disturbance, there no longer needs to be a documentation of informal assessments and interventions occurring. So that was removed out. A reminder of what emotional disturbance is that it's a condition that exhibits one or more of the following characteristics. So we're talking about an emotional disturbance condition that exhibits different characteristics for a long period of time to a marked degree. And so those conditions are still those 5 factors. The first one has been changed back to IDEA language, so the limited school experience and cultural differences was removed from the statement. So the statement now reads, an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. So an emotional disturbance condition that is impacting a student's inability to learn, which is not explained by those other factors. So we're thinking about those characteristics that might go along with some mental health challenges or emotional needs that may impact learning. And the guidance document kind of breaks that down a little bit further for you, so I would recommend you go and review that as soon as it's posted. The other characteristic that was changed is number 3. It previously read that inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings when no major or unusual stressors were evident. And it now reads inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. Again, that language was changed because it reflects IDEA statements. And again, further guidance can be found in the guidance evaluation packet. Nothing changed for characteristics 4 and 5. It's still expected that a student may display a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, or a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. Again, a breakdown of how those might be manifested are included in the guidance document. The language involving mental health diagnoses that might be included was changed to match IDEA language, so it now states emotional disturbance includes schizophrenia. However, it's important to note that emotional disturbance could include any other mental health diagnoses that would fit this characteristics as well. The language that had been previously added regarding social maladjustment has been removed, as that's not part of IDEA language. And so again, we're talking about social maladjustment not being the cause of the disability of the characteristics. However, it's not a rule-out statement. So it's not a statement stating that if a student shows social maladjustment behaviors, they could not be emotionally disturbed. As the definition states, that it's possible that the student also demonstrate emotional disturbance. And that may be co-occurring. So to keep that in mind, and again, the guidance document will give you some more information regarding how to interpret this. So our evaluation procedures, you can see there's some changes from what was to what currently is in place. Behavioral data is now no longer a required component. What we are asking is that you review any interventions and data that's been collected regarding the behavior of concern, the length of time it's been demonstrated, and then the reactions to different interventions. So what we're looking for is information that will guide the team in making decisions regarding the impact, the severity, the length of duration, what ways the student responds to interventions, the intensity of interventions that may be needed in the future for the student to determine the best level of placement in the programming for that student's needs. So that information is there to help guide the team in making decisions. It's not a requirement that a student have a certain level of interventions in order to be evaluated or to determine eligibility. The evaluation of locus of control is removed. Characteristics of emotional disturbance, when we're talking about what those are, that needs to be documented in your evaluation. It also needs to be documented the length of time that those have been observed, the duration of them, as well as the characteristics when you're doing your observations need to include the significance of those behaviors and emotional differences that occur in frequency, intensity, and duration. So looking at those different characteristics in frequency, intensity, duration in mind. If they're not directly observed, then you also follow up with your observations on some indirect information from teachers and those who work with the student. We're talking about the assessment processes that have to occur. Instead of looking at personality factors, we want to make sure that we're focusing on the characteristics associated with the disability, so focusing on those social and emotional factors by various rating scales that could be completed. The educational assessment is now termed academic skills, and again, this is because depending on the needs of the student, the assessments that may take place for academic skills may vary. It may be a review of present levels of skills based on classroom performance and statewide tests and previous performance, but it also may be an individualized achievement test, and that's going to be based on your referral concerns and the things that the student is struggling with. Additional professionals were added to our participant list. However, those were listed under members as indicated or members that could be involved, not necessarily required members. And so that we added numbers that you might want to keep in mind as you're completing your evaluation, that they may be people that you may need for part of your evaluation, depending on the needs of the student. Functional delay definition, there was only one change, and I'll get to that in a second, but the majority of it stayed the same. This is still a disability that's looking at significantly impaired cognitive ability or intellectual ability, significantly impaired academic skills, so deficits below the fourth, at or below the fourth percentile in at least 2 areas that are listed, and then home or school adaptive behaviors that are above the level required for intellectual disability. So while this hasn't changed, the third requirement regarding adaptive behavior will look different, considering that the adaptive behaviors for intellectual disability are changing. So keep that in mind, that while we're not changing the requirements associated with functional delay in regards to adaptive skills, that those adaptive skills will change regardless because of the change in intellectual disability category. Just for some background information, functional delay was recommended to be removed from our disability categories. However, it's currently in our Tennessee state law, and therefore it cannot be removed based on a state board decision. It has to be removed initially by going through the legislative process, and that did not occur at this time. So in the meantime, the reason why it was suggested that be removed is because functional delay is really only a Tennessee education-specific disability. It does not is not present in any other state. It is not part of any other category in any other community, whether that be the clinical, medical, or education community outside of Tennessee. And it is not, there's nothing else that's even like functional delay anywhere else. And so we want to make sure that it's used judiciously. It's not used commonly unless there's a reason to use it for students, because it can create potential issues for that student as they're moving across state borders and having to be reevaluated potentially. So for that reason, we've added some language in that states that other disability categories should be used or shall be used if they're more descriptive of the student's strengths and needs, and that the team has to rule out that the student would not have qualified for intellectual disability, speech or language impairment, specific learning disabilities, or visual, motor, or hearing disability. So making sure if that student would have qualified for one of those other disability categories, they cannot fit the category for functional delay. So for intellectual disability, as we talked about, there have been some changes. The actual definition did not change. You can see that it's still characterized by significantly impaired intellectual functioning and existing concurrently with deficits in adaptive behavior. So while the definition hasn't changed, our interpretation of what that means changes. And we did this based on a national review. Any of the major changes that we made is based on a national review, as well as a look at OSEP guidance, as well as best practices in various national associations. And so when we reviewed this, what we found is that the majority of states, the majority of agencies outside of the education system view this differently than the way that Tennessee has historically viewed it, and that those concurrent deficits don't necessarily have to match the same degree of intellectual functioning. So we're going to talk about that in a second here. First, let's focus on intellectual functioning. While we're still talking about significantly impaired functioning at 2 or more standard deviations below the mean with consideration of the standard error of measurement, what was removed is that it previously stated at the 68% confidence level. That actually is no longer published on most assessment tools, and that's why that was removed, and we left that up to the discretion of the team as far as the confidence level that goes to. What we recommend is at least over 98%. When the SDM is used, or when we see significantly discrepant scores between our verbal index of whatever measure you're given and the other high loading indexes, we want to make sure that we are not somehow misidentifying students under intellectual disability when really there's a language delay or a language impairment that's impacting a student's ability to perform well on a verbal measure. Even a verbal measure that has nonverbal components can be skewed, directions are given verbally. So in those cases where you see a significant discrepancy, and the technical manuals of our assessment tools should tell us when that's the case, then you need to make sure that you follow up with a nonverbal measure, not a nonverbal portion of a verbal test, but an actual nonverbal measure to measure that ability level, and that the team can make that a decision based on the best estimate of ability. In addition, for our intellectual disability category, the change to adaptive behaviors, as I mentioned before, has to do based on that national review. And so nationally, in most clinical contexts, as well as various other states who are following what the common view is associated with intellectual disability is that our previous scores or our previous evaluation procedures stated that we had to have a composite, so a global score of adaptive behaviors need to be significantly impaired, so 2 or more standard deviations below the mean, which then left students who might be identified in other means such as function delay. Now what we're stating is that we're trying to go back to best practice and what the common understanding is, and that's that there's at least one domain of adaptive behavior that's impaired, or the global composite. So one domain or more, or the global composite is impaired. And those domains of adaptive functioning are stated to be termed conceptual, social, or practical adaptive functioning. So some of our assessment tools have those already kind of labeled in that same way. It's not necessarily labeled the same on every single measure. But the breakdown of skills associated with each one of those adaptive functioning areas is laid out in the guidance document that is associated. You can also research it, and it will tell you what those areas typically break down to include. So if you're using an assessment tool that doesn't have them labeled as conceptual, social, or practical, really just see how those line up. But that we're looking at a domain area that's at least 2 standard deviations below the mean. So that means if a student scores 2 standard deviations below the mean in conceptual, or social, or practical, or the global, a student could meet this category's criteria. Still need to document, when appropriate, some systematic observations and impressions regarding the developmental history with the principal caretaker. We have changed some of the language regarding the school-based adaptive. Instead of saying when appropriate, we said for school-age children. So for children who are in a school environment or in some sort of daycare program, whatever situation that they might be in, that we have somebody else provide another measure of adaptive behavior so that we can have multiple views in multiple settings. And again, we're looking at one domain area or the global area. That's 2 standard deviations below the mean, with consideration of standard error of measurement. In every one of these, again, it's a consideration of standard error of measurement. Again, still systematic observations, and based on those age ranges, what we're looking for. So the question that's come up is, what do we do when there's a discrepancy between home and school adaptive rating scales or community rating scales? And so when that's the case, we looked and we researched best practices, and what we found is that what it's advised to do in those cases is that a systematic observation occur by the assessment specialist who's most knowledgeable about adaptive behaviors, so they can provide some professional judgment in regards to where those abilities actually lie. So I would advise them looking at your 2 different rating scales to identify those areas that it conflicted and doing a systematic observation on those areas that conflicted to make some, to provide some professional judgment in regards to the student's ability level in those areas. And so that observation should help the team determine what the most appropriate adaptive behavior level is when you're considering this disability category. There were no changes when we're looking at those rule-out factors associated with the primary cause of things that may impact test performance, such as limited English proficiency, cultural factors, medical conditions, environmental factors, communication, sensory, or motor disabilities. So we're still trying to rule out that none of those things are the reasons why the student performed poorly on a test before we're identifying the student under intellectual disability. And that this disability does take place during the developmental period between birth to 18 years of age. Intellectually gifted had quite a few changes to it. The definition is the first area where things changed, and you can see that there was some added language, the first of which documents how that student's abilities are so outstanding. They're so outstanding that the child needs exceed those that can be differentiated through the general education programming. So we're looking at, again, a way to measure that need, a way to look at need for services, and how that might adversely affect a student's performance such that they need specialized designed instruction or support services. Another statement was added as well to make sure that we're keeping in mind to include those populations that are typically underrepresented in the intellectually gifted community. Students do, or children can be qualified regardless of their background. And again, that's just, again, for awareness to make sure that we are being very aware and that we're not excluding individuals based on potential assessment practices. And so as we talk about those assessment practices, you'll see how we're trying to address underrepresented youth as we're evaluating students. So when we're talking about the actual evaluation procedures, you'll see that there was just some minor changes in regarding to wording in the initial part of the evaluation procedures. We're reviewing multiple criteria with multiple assessment measures, and that's what we're doing throughout the assessment process. The screening outline that's included in the evaluation procedures was revised a little bit to match what the current policy has been through memos that were sent out, as well as to make sure that this is not necessarily a requirement to precede the evaluation. A systematic screening should occur for all students, whether it's by your school-wide data review on a yearly basis, in addition to a grade level screening or not. So that yearly information needs to be reviewed every year. However, some districts may choose to add an additional grade level screening. We also want to include teacher checklists, state assessment data through your screening process. And then for those students who need more individualized screening, we want to pay attention to the needs that may exceed differentiated instruction, especially in the areas of educational performance and creativity and characteristics of giftedness. And again, this is by review, so as we're doing our evaluation, we're reviewing what has been done and determining what else we need to do for that evaluation. We do not have to screen in order to be evaluated. When we're looking at our assessment model, while we know for all evaluations that there is no singular assessment that should determine eligibility, we're reviewing our body of evidence, and that collection of evidence would include your standard error of measurement. So we're not focusing on just one score, we're focusing on the totality of the information that we collect on a student. There's a reference in the new standards that pulls you back to that gifted assessment matrix, that assessment grid. That documents the various areas of educational performance, creativity, and characteristics of giftedness and cognitive and intellectual ability. That breaks down those different scoring options. It breaks down how many points that you must earn in order to meet the criteria for giftedness. That gifted matrix is the assessment documentation form that's linked to the state website and has been updated. The updates include what we're about to talk about for cognition, which I'll talk about in a second, and it also includes some updated measures that have been added to the assessment. So for the intellectual ability or cognition, what we're looking for now are scores that are at or above the 94th percentile. That's typically around your standard score of 123 or above. Previously, we had a minimum score of 118. Both of those should consider that standard error of measurement. So while we're not landing on that one score, again, no single score, we're looking at that spread within that standard error of measurement. But again, this is based on a case-by-case basis, based on the unique needs of that student, based on the impact of the potential factors with that unique student that may play into their performance on test results, as well as the collection of evidence that supports that this may be an underrepresented or overrepresented score, estimate of ability. So on the assessment documentation form, you may see, if you have it pulled up, that the previous minimum score of 118, you were able to receive 10 points on that matrix for that score. Now the 123 was at 20, it still is at 20. So the minimum score that you can have for cognition will give you 20 points on that assessment tool. So while it's increased, you still get that same amount of points that you would have gotten previously. And again, that standard error of measure should be considered based on the unique needs of that student. And we're going to talk about that in relation to specifically students from underrepresented groups. So for those traditionally underrepresented youth, this is actually in the standard. We want to make sure that this is pulled out and it is very much aware in your mind when you're doing your assessment, that you should consider alternate assessment measures to reduce potential cultural and linguistic bias for that student. So based on that student review, using your TNAISF form, the form that documents the differences of that student, you want to make sure that you're choosing assessment tools that will best measure ability based on that student's background. It may mean that you need to give a nonverbal assessment, not a nonverbal portion of a verbal assessment, but an actual nonverbal measure. We know that actually has helped mitigate a lot of the cultural and linguistical biases that may occur, especially from our students that come from low economic backgrounds that may have low language exposure. And so we want to make sure that is best assessed appropriately. Sometimes our twice exceptional youth, we may need to use some alternate composites that pull out some mitigating impacts of their other disabilities that may go into play on their overall ability. And so, again, it refers to the guidance of that standard area of measurement for underrepresented youth, and it kind of goes the same for all youth. When we're talking about specifically those underrepresented youth, as I've mentioned before, we're using that Tennessee Assessment Instrumentation Selection Form. We're ruling out any factors that could have impacted tested, using a nonverbal assessment when appropriate, or using alternate global measures. So the assessment tools, the publishers have, on some tools, provided alternate measures of global or full scale, if you want to call it, measures. Not quite full scale, it's the alternate to your full scale. For example, the WISC-4 and the WISC-5 of the General Ability Index. That's an example of one of them. Rather than call out all the different types of alternate global composites that could be used, recommending is that you look at the publishers of those tools, how they recommend using them, following their recommendations of when to use them and when not to use them. And that those global alternate composites need to have a high reliability. So that's, if we're using a measure that's different than what the alternate, what the full scale measure is, then we need to make sure that's a reliable measure, because some of those alternate measures are not very reliable. Those alternate composites are not very reliable. So, and we're giving you an approximate range, approximately 9.0 or above. We know that 0.8 and above is good, 0.9 is great reliability. So, approximately falling around that line of 0.9, not necessarily a hard cut line on 0.9 or above, but approximately around that range. Same thing goes to if you have a discrepancy between a high composite area, so your verbal composite areas, your nonverbal composite areas, your perceptual reasoning, fluid reasoning. If you've got a highly loading component of the cognitive assessment area that loads highly into the global measurement of intelligence, if there's a discrepancy between that and another component area that's 1.5 standard deviations from that other major component area, that you're able to use alternate, that major area that's 130 or above, but that component area needs to be at least approximately 0.9 or above in regards to reliability. So again, we're looking at how strong is this standalone composite area compared to the global, and making sure that we are not using measures that are not very reliable. In regards to educational performance and creativity, we're still measuring the same thing. We just took out additional language to kind of help clarify that this information, again, the assessment team will determine what's needed based on what information you have prior to referral. Make sure that you evaluate the student as best you can to get the best performance and best estimates of ability. Again, the guidance assessment documentation form, the gifted assessment documentation form will provide you with a breakdown of the different measures that can be used, and the guidance document goes into a little bit further as well. So for orthopedic impairment, the only language that was added to the definition was to clarify that the example of different orthopedic impairments that's included is not exhaustive, and it's not limited to those that are included in the definition. So that would include your congenital anomalies, your diseases that could potentially cause an orthopedic impairment, and the impairments caused by other things such as cerebral palsy, amputations, fractures, burns, that cause contractures. So you can see it's not limited. If there is another severe orthopedic impairment that a doctor has identified, then again, that can be considered. So the first thing that was added was just a breakdown of, again, who a medical provider is. It's the same list that's associated with just about every disability category that requires a licensed medical provider, and that's your licensed medical physician, the physician's assistant, or a licensed nurse practitioner. Previously, a motor evaluation was not included in the evaluation for orthopedic impairment, so that was added to make sure that we're addressing the student's orthopedic needs. So that motor evaluation would address mobility and activities of daily living. Depending on the student, that might be an occupational therapy evaluation, it might be a physical therapy evaluation. It depends on, again, the referral needs of that student. Some of the examples of things we're looking for are maintaining and changing positions, safety, movement throughout the building, balance, self-care, eating, vocation, and transition. So previously the definition did include social and physical adaptive behaviors related to orthopedic impairment, and that's just changed to an adaptive measure. Since we're already doing our physical motor evaluation, we want to make sure that we're also addressing adaptive behaviors, and that can be done by informal or formal means. We're looking at the various ways that the student's orthopedic impairment may impact their independent skills and functioning on their daily lives. We also added in an educational evaluation. That may be in an individual or group administrative achievement test, or it can be their classroom observations, criterion reference tests such as your 10 Ready or ACT, curriculum-based assessments, and the review of their existing records, health, and attendance. So we're looking at the overall review of that student's educational performance. Depending on the needs of that student, depending on the referral concerns and how difficult academic skills are for them, you may need to go more deep in your evaluation, or you may have sufficient information based on a review of all of the information that you currently have from the teacher, as well as past performance on tests. In regards to participants, an occupational therapist or physical therapist were added to the list of required participants since there is now a required motor evaluation. And then in the list of other potential people that you may include, it's not required, but you may include them, we added licensed school psychologists, and that's due to the adaptive behaviors and potential individual achievement tests. Of course, that was not exhaustive under the other personnel that you might want to include, so you could include other people to help with those assessment areas as well. For other health impairment, there were no changes to the definition. We're still looking at a chronic or acute health problem that impacts limited strength, vitality, alertness, and to their environment stimuli. And there are still some examples. That's not an exhaustive list, again, of different health conditions that could be present. We're looking for how those health conditions impact a student's learning, such as impaired organizational work skills and inability to manage or complete tasks, excessive health absenteeism, or medication that affects cognitive functioning. The only thing that changed in regards to our medical statement is that we added in the breakdown of, again, those medical providers. In regards to, actually I want to go back real quick to the evaluation. Previously it stated in our definition, it still states that diagnoses of ADHD could be made by psychologists, clinical psychologists outside of the school system, and other licensed professionals that are capable of making these diagnoses. However, that does not preclude the need for a medical evaluation or diagnosis. You still need one of those, both of those as well, even if it's just confirming the diagnosis that was made by the clinical provider. In addition, I want to also remind districts that the evaluation, the medical evaluation, cannot be at parent expense. So if something needs to take place outside of what's already been done, that you can access through the student's health history from their physician, that it should not be at parent expense. The academic skills have always been required. That has not changed. We just moved it to a different part of the list. And again, this is the same for all that say academic skills, that it depends on the referral need on how deep you go, whether it's an individual test of achievement or whether it's based on a review of your curriculum-based measures, criterion reference assessments that have been provided, and various other things that you may have collected in regards to students' academic skills. This is not, the next section has not changed. Again, it's been changed for clarity only. So previously it was required that a psychoeducational assessment be done on the 5 major areas, and then in addition to that, the academic achievement skills or academic skills. What has been clarified is that that's by formal or informal assessment. So that's not necessarily a change, but again, it is a clarification that those 5 areas that need to be assessed, motor or physical communication, cognitive, adaptive behaviors, and social emotional functioning. Those areas can be done either informally or formally depending on the referral need. They do need to be included. All 5 areas need to be included in your evaluation. All 5 areas need to be addressed. They can be addressed informally through checklists and observations, or formally through a direct assessment or a normative standardized assessment. For speech or language, there's quite a bit of language added to the definition for speech or language, and we've had some questions about the actual disability name where it says speech or language impairment. It's actually the way it's listed in the IDEA and our state law and our state rules. So it's listed as speech or language impairment, and then depending on what the team has found as far as the actual disability deficit area, that's typically what identifies the deficit area. So for the overall, when we're talking about the overall disability category, what we're looking at is that it's not a disability that's based on language learning, so it's not that the student hasn't acquired English yet. It's not due to cognitive referencing, so we're not going to cognitive referencing. What that means basically is that if a student has an IQ of let's say 78, we wouldn't expect their language to be above that. Therefore, any language skills that are around that same range of your cognitive ability, they wouldn't have a language impairment. So that's not, again, with best practice. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding any type of cognitive referencing, and that we also avoid misidentifying dialectical differences as a speech impairment or a language impairment. Specific to the definition of what a language impairment is, you can see that there's quite a bit of information that's been added. Again, it's more for clarity's sake and to follow what best practice says as far as what language is and how to understand what that is. It doesn't mean that we are not looking at receptive or expressive language anymore. That can definitely be identified as a language impairment when we're talking about expressive language or receptive language. But really what makes up those areas have to do with the form of language, the content of language, and the use of language. So we're talking about those aspects that then may impair receptive or expressive language, or pragmatics. That's also an area of language that can be identified. So for speech language is also termed speech sound production, and some places that language is added in. And again, some additional information was added for reference to make sure that we're understanding completely what articulation involves, that it's a significant atypical production of speech sounds, that it's characterized by substitutions, omissions, additions, or distortions that interfere with intelligibility in conversation speech, and obstructs learning and successful verbal communication in the educational setting. Those are different than the medical model in that we're looking at not only are there atypical productions of sounds, but it's also obstructing learning and obstructing the child's ability to be a successful communicator in their educational setting. And that also could be a result of impaired phonology, motor, or other issues. Fluency, we just added some language for clarity's sake that a fluency impairment involves the interruption of the flow of speech that's characterized by atypical rate and rhythm of repetitions and sounds, symbols, and words and phrases that significantly reduces the speaker's ability to participate in the learning environment. There were no changes to the voice definition. So for the language evaluation, you can see that there was some information that was added to our previous standard regarding the comprehensive assessment that must be given for language. So previously it just stated that there's analysis of receptive or expressive language or a total composite score. That's still the case. We're still looking at receptive or expressive language or the total composite. But what we've stated is that it at least needs to be one minimum comprehensive assessment. So one measure that's looking at everything, looks at the totality of the student's language ability, looking at the form, the content, the structure, all of that part of their language that can break it down into receptive or expressive and gives you that global measure. And again, just like with any other disability category that looks at standard deviations or specific scores, that we're not using it as a cutoff. We're considering the standard error of measurement based on an individual basis for that student with the same guidance that's provided for your SEM for all disability categories. In addition, we're looking at a second measure that's documenting that area of deficit being at 1.5 standard deviations below the mean with the consideration of that standard error of measurement. So while before we just looked for a second measure, didn't really specify what kind, now we're still looking for another standardized measure. Knowing that it's not always easy to capture a student's skills in a standardized measure, that's why that standard error measure could be considered. If you're having difficulty getting those scores based on the standard error measures, but you do see that there are some concerns based on that spread within the SEM. Some other ways to gather information for that collected evidence that helps you determine which way, if it's an underestimate of ability or not, might be your language samples, doing analysis of those language samples. It may be doing direct observations, doing a variety of different things that will give you information that then gives the team more guidance on whether or not what band of scores to go within and how high or how low to address those scores. So really you're looking again at that collection of evidence, and your guidance documents will go into that a little bit more as far as how to collect additional information when it's questionable whether or not that score is an under or overestimate of ability. Pragmatics is also now an area that needs to be assessed if it's identified as an area of concern. So, if social language is not an area of concern, we don't want to necessarily overtest the student, but if it's been identified as a potential area, it needs to be assessed as that could be an area of language impairment that a student may demonstrate. We removed some of the some of the requirements that states regarding receptive and expressive language, as it's kind of redundant since it was already included in the previous standard. And then we've added making sure that we're collecting teacher and parent input as part of your evaluation. Remember, this is a team process where we should have multiple, all team members that are listed in our participant list providing information so that the assessment specialist has multiple sources of information from a variety of perspectives. For articulation, you can see some of the changes. The new language is bolded on the screen. So what's added is that the articulation errors that we're looking at need to persist at least 1 year behind expectancy compared to current developmental norms. And there are some state-approved norms provided in the guidance document. They're the recommended norms that districts use. However, that said, if the student is not represented in the norms that are provided in the guidance document, then make sure that you choose norms that would be more representative of that student. So we're not saying that you can't use outside norms of those if their student would not have been represented based on the norms. And then, and those are the basic norms that are typically associated with articulation issues, such as your Golden and Bristow and various other norms that might be included as well. Additionally, we've also added that there needs to be an appropriate standardized instrument to include phonetic inventory and an assessment of phonological processes. So the phonetic inventory is required. The assessment of phonological processes is as appropriate. So that's based on what you're seeing as an evaluation need once you're starting your evaluation. And then there are some state-approved norms associated with those as well in the guidance document. And again, the same goes for these norms. If the student does not fit the norms provided, then you need to find a set of norms that would better represent that student. Additionally, when we're talking about adverse impact, we're trying to look at that severity. So what degrees that students' articulation difficulties or articulation delays causing that student to have impaired academic skills or academic or learning or communication with their peers in order to participate in the learning environment. So we've added in that the assessment specialist needs to complete a severity rating scale, and that are provided on the website as well as in the guidance document that will look at moderate, severe, and profound ratings. And again, this is to provide evidence to help the team make decisions when they're looking at eligibility for services on the need and the adverse impact of the students demonstrating. And again, we added teacher checklists and input and parent input to this list as well. There were no major changes in the procedures associated with speech and language, and voice and fluency as part of speech or language impairment. And now we're to the visual impairment. This is our last one we're going to talk about for this webinar. On visual impairment, remember these changes also go along with the changes that are made to deaf-blindness. So keep in mind that everything I'm talking about in visual impairment, that mirrors the changes that would take place for deaf-blindness as well. So when we're talking about the types of visual impairment that may occur, our current and prior definition lists 3 different types of visual impairment. The first of which is a visual acuity issue that states a visual acuity in the better eye or both eyes with best possible correction are at either legal blindness or low vision. So legal blindness is defined as 20/200. That has not changed. That's consistent with current practices. Low vision was defined differently based on our review of current best practices as well as talking with multiple professionals in the vision community. Low vision is actually defined as 20/70, so that was changed to match what our current understanding of low vision is. To kind of reiterate this, some of you may have seen that OSAP guidance has come out that states that you cannot solely wait on visual acuity to define visual impairment, and that is the case with our definition as well. We're trying to be consistent with IDEA. So visual impairment, the other 2 that are not listed could also be included in the visual impairment, and the third one of which says that a visual could be any other visual impairment that's identified that's not perceptual in nature. So we're not looking at those difficulties with vision that have nothing to do with actual vision centers of the brain, but we're looking at any other vision impairment that could be identified by a physician. So the evaluation procedures, some of the language was just moved around. You can see that what was moved for clarity's sake was that the reason for functional vision and media assessment is to help determine the primary learning style, including reading, writing, and listening, and tactile skills for that student. So How is that student best learning? What is the needs of that student? What do they need to learn how to do in order to be able to participate in the education environment? And the first of that type of assessment includes your expanded core curriculum. So our previous expanded core curriculum only had 7 areas listed. Well, and there are actually 9 expanded core curriculum areas, and so we wanted to make sure that the 2 that were missing from our previous list of expanded core areas. And those 2 areas are sensory efficiency and self-determination. If you're not familiar with those and you want to learn what those are, your TVI, your teacher for visually impaired students, students with visual impairments, are trained in this, but if you're a team member who needs more information about that, you can find information in our guidance document that will be posted. Additional language was added in for the expanded core area of orientation and mobility. How deeply you go into that evaluation is determined by that student and the actual unique needs of that child. If a screening is all that's needed because you have enough information by that, a TVI can complete that, a certified teacher for students with visual impairment. However, if you need a full assessment, it must be completed by an orientation and mobility specialist. So that is listed again in the standards. What was added to the school history and levels of educational performance is that it needs to include teacher, student, and parent interviews, again, trying to make sure that we're including all members of our team when we're collecting information about the needs of the students. And then additional language was added for non-traditional students. So those non-readers or nonverbal students, as well as those with cortical visual impairment, you'll need a modified visual impairment vision assessment to determine their primary learning media, as well as their visual, tactile, and auditory needs. That was it in regards to the disability changes. It was a really quick snapshot view of all the changes, and again, I would highly recommend that you spend some time going through the various standards, the comparison document from what was to what is, and that you're using those assessment documentation forms for your evaluations to make sure that you're not missing any component as you go through those assessments, because there have been quite a few changes, and we want to make sure that you're not missing any of those changes that have occurred. And in addition, we will be working on some next steps. So currently I'm in the process of completing trainings across the state in the month of July and some in August as well. If your district requires potentially some specific trainings because of some issues that you're seeing, we ask that the lead assessment specialists or lead supervisors request those trainings through our professional development site on the special education website or special populations website of the Department of Ed. There's a link on that site for requests for professional development, and those are considered on a case-by-case basis. And then we determine how we can best meet your needs based on your request. Additionally, the guidance documents that have been mentioned multiple times will hopefully be ready for posting before the beginning of August. Again, it really depends on how quickly those can be finalized. But those will be posted soon, and those, again, should provide some guidance on all the standards, as well as some just general language for those who are unfamiliar with the evaluation process to make sure that you're following best practices and that you understand what the process entails. So be looking for those. When we're talking about those guidance documents, those that have been completed, you can see that there's quite a few. Previously we only had, I think we had 5 disabilities that did not include resource packets. Those resource packets that were previously on the website, are actually still on the website, were really outdated now that we've made changes to the evaluation standards and definitions. And so those will be changed out. As I said before, the goal is to link them individually under the disability categories under the assessment documentation forms for an easy catch. And then the previous ones will be linked to the prior standards that is included in our long list of previous definitions and standards. So if you don't find them on the website in their usual place, the old documents will be included in our previous information that's posted under that one heading, that one link. If you have questions or concerns, feel free to give me a call or email me. My name is Joanna Bivens. So my email address is Joanna, Joanna, .Bivens, BIVINS, @tn.gov. I'm the Director of School Psychology Services in the Office of Special Populations. My phone number is 615-741-9231. If I'm out of the office traveling, I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Like I said, if you have any questions, I'm happy to be available to answer them up. Thank you very much.